down there, the modern city of Pittsburgh. Hello, I'm Ellen Gilberti. From up here, you can see the whole downtown and the location of this city at the junction of three great rivers, the Monongahela and the Allegheny, joining to form the Ohio. Over 300,000 people live in this city. Over there's the ballpark, named appropriately enough, Three Rivers Stadium. Football fans will know it as the home of the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers, steel. For many years, this city was closely identified with steel. On the banks of these rivers were the world's largest and most efficient steel mills, producing 1/4 of this country's total output of steel, all in this one city.
The story of Pittsburgh is part of a larger story about an industrial revolution. Powerful machines driven by steam and electricity replaced hand tools and muscle power. Work was done in huge factories or mills instead of at home or in small shops. The Industrial Revolution started slowly during the first half of the 19th century. Then after the Civil War, it hit hard in Pittsburgh and other urban centers. The Industrial Revolution transformed the way people worked and lived, and even the face of the land. Why did an industrial revolution happen in Pittsburgh? How did it change the city's natural and human characteristics? Places can be described in many ways. This is how Pittsburgh looked in the beginning of the 19th century. Nature still overshadowed this small town of wooden houses. Wooded hills, capped by plateaus, rose sharply from the narrow valleys along the three rivers. But right from the founding of the country, Pittsburgh was also seen as a center of trade and transportation. In an era before railroads and cars, rivers were how you got from there to here, carrying people, food, livestock, and raw materials, everything you needed to build a nation. And Pittsburgh's rivers were navigable, allowing boats and barges to travel right through to the mighty Mississippi River and to the port of New Orleans. The city was also blessed with another gift, coal. Rich bituminous coal buried right in these hills. Coal was a source of energy and an essential raw material in heavy industry. Nature had provided Pittsburgh with the ingredients for becoming a major industrial center. What would the people do with these resources? A new invention, the railroad, was beginning to change the face of the United States, and the railroads would need iron track, hundreds of miles of it. Some of this track was made in Pittsburgh, by now a bustling city of factories and small foundries. Manufacturing meant new jobs, and the city began to grow. Immigrants arrived here from England, Wales, Ireland, and Germany, and they found work. With all these new people, it was soon obvious that the natural characteristic which made Pittsburgh so picturesque also limited its growth. The rivers separated communities and blocked movement of people and goods. Bridges, dozens of them, had to be built. And the hills rising steeply from the river valleys left very little flat land on which to build factories, transportation routes, and housing. Industry and the growing population both crammed into the valleys. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States was becoming a major industrial power. Factories concentrated in the growing cities of the Northeast were connected to the country by the ever-expanding railroad. 35,000 miles of track would, by the turn of the century, become 200,000 miles of lines linking north and south, east and west. Iron rails, iron bridges, iron locomotives, iron and steel tools. How would the United States produce so much iron? to this time, iron had been smelted in stone and brick devices known as furnaces. Because transportation was so expensive, furnaces like these were scattered all over the country near sources of raw materials. Iron production was a small-scale industry, turning out a few tons of iron a day, enough to supply the needs of local blacksmiths. But railroads required hundreds of thousands of tons of iron. After the middle of the century, a technological change, newly designed blast furnaces, made it possible to use coal to produce iron in large quantities. In Pittsburgh's backyard were mountains of coal. Iron ore was within easy reach of the city. It had skilled workers and factories of all kinds already in place, and was linked by water and rail with the entire country. What was already a large manufacturing center soon became an industrial colossus. By the 1870s, the newly arriving workers moved into already crowded housing. Families lived often several to a room, in boarding houses with a common toilet and no heat or running water. And still, there was the problem of where to build. There was not much room left on the narrow river valleys. Squeezed onto this scarce flat land was all the industry, all the transportation, the stores, and the houses. At the top of the steep hills, the owners of the factories built magnificent mansions. This is Henry Clay Frick's house. Mr. Frick had become a millionaire by the time he was 30, and he wasn't the richest man in town. Industry attracted many men of brilliance and imagination to Pittsburgh, but there was one man who epitomized the spirit of the age. If others were smart and ruthless, he was smarter and more ruthless. If others thought big, he thought gigantic. He arrived in a Pittsburgh that was already a major manufacturing center and transformed it into the world's leading maker of steel. In the process, he was to become one of the richest men in the world. His name? Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie's family came to America from Scotland in 1848. His family was poor, but Carnegie was smart and ambitious. He soon got a job with the huge Pennsylvania Railroad. Carnegie saw that the railroad was having problems with its track. It was running ever larger and heavier trains, and the soft iron tracks quickly wore out. Steel tracks would last much longer, but the metal had to be imported from England and was expensive. Carnegie realized that he could make a lot of money producing steel in the United States.
This is the Bessemer converter, where iron was refined into steel. Andrew Carnegie had left the railroad and put all his talent and energy into the large-scale production of steel. He built these monstrous new inventions on the banks of the Monongahela River in the outskirts of Pittsburgh. Today, they're rusting museum pieces, but when they were operational, they looked and sounded like rocket engines.
It was steel making on a huge scale. Cheap, good quality steel. And as Carnegie knew, the railroads would buy all the steel he could produce. In 1873, Carnegie built the most advanced steel mill in the world. This one plant could produce 30,000 tons of steel rail a year, earning Carnegie and his investors a profit of almost $1 million. Carnegie reduced the complex production of steel to a simple recipe.
2 pounds of iron ore mined upon the shores of Lake Superior and transported 900 miles to Pittsburgh. 1.5 pounds of coal mined and manufactured into coke and transported to Pittsburgh. 1/2 pound of limestone mined and transported to Pittsburgh. A small amount of manganese mined in Virginia and brought to Pittsburgh. And these 4 pounds of materials manufactured into 1 pound of steel, for which the consumer pays 1 cent. That's all that needs to be said about the steel business.
But Carnegie knew there was much more to be said. His competitors were also producing steel in modern factories. They too had easy access to the raw materials through water transportation. To stay in business, Carnegie would have to be able to sell steel cheaper than anyone else. The price of the raw materials and transportation would have to be kept low. Factories would have to work at maximum efficiency. He set about to coordinate and control every single step of the process. By the 1870s, Carnegie had started to put together the elements of this complicated system. It began with his huge Lucy blast furnaces, each one having the capacity to refine more iron in a day than the old small furnaces could produce in a year. But his new furnaces were hungry monsters. How would he feed his industrial giant with the steady supply of raw materials necessary to keep the whole system running?
This is the Claret and Coke factory on the Monongahela River upstream from Pittsburgh. Here coal is purified into coke, a major element in the production of steel. And in these hills, there's an almost unlimited supply of coal for making coke. Just a short trip up this river from Carnegie's huge steel mills. But he needed enormous quantities of the coke at a reasonable price to remain competitive.
In the 1880s, this gentleman, Henry Clay Frick, owned 80% of the coal fields and large numbers of coke ovens near Pittsburgh. To guarantee a supply of coke, Carnegie decided to make him a partner in his growing steel empire. But how about the iron ore? Carnegie negotiated rights to buy a seemingly limitless supply of iron ore from the Mesabi Range near the western shores of Lake Superior. The ore was high quality and located just below the surface. You could scoop it up with steam shovels. Iron coming from deep mines could cost $3 a ton. Mesabi iron cost 5 cents a ton. A final problem remained: how to ship these thousands of tons of ore the huge distance to Carnegie's Pittsburgh mills. The ore was loaded onto large ore boats, which then made the journey through the locks which connected Lake Superior to Lake Huron, to Lake Erie, and to the town of Ashtabula, Ohio. It was cheap to send the ore by water, but the last step was very costly. It had to be offloaded from the boats and brought to Pittsburgh by the Pennsylvania Railroad, which Carnegie did not control. It cost him millions of dollars, but Carnegie built his own railroad over 100 miles from the port of Conneaut on Lake Erie directly to his steel mills. When it was completed, he proudly announced to his partners,
Today, Pittsburgh becomes a lake port.
Because transportation made it accessible to both raw materials and growing markets, because of its coal, the skill of its workforce, and because of Carnegie's genius for exploiting new technology and streamlining production, this place called Pittsburgh became the world's largest producer of steel. The factories jammed the riverbanks, and by now housing had pushed up the steep hills to the very heights of the plateaus, hundreds of feet above the valley floor. New immigrant workers continued to come from Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Greece, 100,000 strong. Their work was hard and the hours long. Even the children worked, 12-hour shifts in dangerous factories. In the 1880s, workers in Carnegie's factories received just $1 a day. Pay had actually gone down as steel production and Carnegie's profits went up. Their only hope for better pay and working conditions was to join together in a labor union. But Carnegie was determined to keep costs down and refused to deal with the union. In 1892, here at Carnegie's Homestead Steel Plant, there was a long and bloody strike. The company hired armed guards who fought with the workers. 10 men were killed. In the end, the union was crushed. In Carnegie's relentless drive to increase his profits, this one final element, the workers, had been conquered. By the 1890s, Pittsburgh's natural and human characteristics had changed. What had once been a rolling green wilderness was now a huge, sprawling industrial city. Thousands of chimneys spewed thick black smoke day and night. A wall of huge steelworks lined the rivers which had become industrial sewers filled with foul-smelling chemicals. Visitors and residents alike now came to see the environment around Pittsburgh as a living vision of hell. While it may have been dark and dirty, for many workers and their families, Pittsburgh continued to offer jobs, money, the possibility of a home and an education for their children. The city itself was improving. Paved streets, better housing, libraries, universities, and museums. Carnegie had brought steel to Pittsburgh, and steel had brought prosperity to the city. By the turn of the century, cheap steel also meant prosperity for the entire country. Steel beams built the skyscrapers of the growing cities. Steel was the spine of transportation and the engine of war. A nation's output of steel became the measure of its industrial power. When Carnegie entered the business, the United States was making only a small amount of steel a year. Compared to the industrial giant of Europe, Great Britain, the United States was an underdeveloped nation. But by the early 1900s, it had become the leading industrial power in the world, overtaking all other countries in the production of steel. In the 1990s, they're tearing down the steel mills. Other industries have come to Pittsburgh, and large-scale steel production has moved elsewhere. But for almost a century, these factories in Pittsburgh were the biggest and the best. People like Andrew Carnegie, with a vision and ruthless determination, had made this city great, just as surely as its rivers and its mountains of coal. But there was a price to be paid. The pollution, the labor unrest, the scarred natural environment around the city and as far north as the iron mining regions of Michigan and Minnesota. Heavy costs, but great benefits. Pittsburgh's steel rails opened up the West and tied this country together. And this same steel built the buildings, the bridges, and the cities, the cars, and the kitchen sinks, the very stuff of modern life. Pittsburgh made steel affordable, and steel built the United States.
Pittsburgh paid for its age of steel with smog and pollution and overcrowding. But with money from steel, the city became a wealthy, thriving center of culture and learning.
This city was at the center of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, and it was drastically transformed in the last century. Today, we can stand back from it all and ask some questions. How did the Industrial Revolution change this place? When we add it all up, did the good outweigh the bad?